Hello and welcome to the 16th presentation of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. Good evening, my name is Colin Garrity and I'm a forecaster at Avalanche Canada and I'm your producer for this evening. Nancy Geismar is online as well. She'll be the moderator looking up your questions and your comments in the chat. We're super stoked you're all here tonight. COVID has meant that we're not delivering face-to-face outreach presentations, as you know. It's a shame, but the silver lining of this has been that we've been able to reach so many of you through these online webinars. Our mission, as always, is to help educate backcountry users so that you can go out and play safe. We want you to know more, go farther, and of course, come home. First of all, we'd like to thank our sponsors. We have our government partners, very critical funding partners. Oop, I missed one, our backup. Our program partners, MEC Tech and Columbia Basin Trust, and our premier sponsors, as well as our many contributors. Just before we begin, I want to go through a few housekeeping notes. Everybody should know that they're muted automatically in the GoToWebinar software. There will be opportunities to ask questions during and after the presentation. So to do so, click on the raise hand icon in the GoTo dashboard. I'll unmute you so that you can ask a question. Another way to ask a question if you're nervous about being on the mic is the question chat box, which is also found on the GoTo dashboard. Now, tonight's presentation is on low probability, high consequence avalanches. Deep persistent layers can be a sleeping dragon. When they get woken up, they're incredibly destructive. Our presenter this evening is Avalanche Canada forecaster, Kate Devine. Kate is going to speak with us about how the low probability, high consequence scenario evolves. What are the key terms in avalanche forecasts that you need to be aware of? How do you track deep, potentially destructive snowpack layers? How do you keep the right mindset if you're heading into the backcountry when a low probability, high consequence avalanche problem is in play? Our snowpack this year is setting up to have these kinds of low probability, high consequence avalanche problems. You don't want to be a trigger or a target for one of these avalanches because when they go, they tend to go really big. Kate has been a forecaster at AvCan for 3 years. She's also a ski guide and owner of Selkirk Lodge. She's Revelstoke born and bred. Having grown up on ski, she has spent every winter observing the snowpack, analyzing how and where to get to the best turns for the conditions, and just as importantly, knowing when to step back, choose conservative terrain, or wait for the conditions to improve. So I'll pass it over to Kate now. You can go ahead and turn on your webcam and your mic, and we'll get started on your presentation.
Thanks,
hey,
Colin.
Kate. Yeah, you bet. We got you live there, and you can go ahead or I'll just share the presenter baton with you. And you've got your screen sharing. Perfect. Okay, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Hey, welcome everybody. Excited that you guys are keen to join us for this presentation. As Colin mentioned, this evening we're going to talk about low probability, high consequence avalanches. So we're going to discuss low probability, high consequence avalanches. So we're going to take the next 30 to 40 minutes to examine what we mean when we say that. So we want to look at what kind of conditions lead to this scenario and what we can do to reduce our risk during times when this is in play. So a little bit of background on the image that you guys are seeing on the screen right now is this was taken in Yoho National Park with Mount Opabin in the background. So the prominent avalanche in the foreground was sympathetically triggered by a natural cornice size 3.5 avalanche running in the upper left bowl. So this event happened after a brief wind event woke up a deep persistent slab problem that had been laying dormant for the prior 2 months. So quite some time before, some time since anyone had seen any activity on that layer. So what does it mean? It means there's a low chance, of triggering an avalanche, but if you do, it'll be large and destructive. You could put these avalanches in the unsurvivable category. So why do we care about low probability, high consequence avalanches so much, especially if they're low probability? Well, the answer to that is because they're very difficult to predict where and when they will be triggered. So there's a high level of uncertainty. And when someone is caught, if someone is caught, it very often ends up as an injury or fatality. So this image was taken in Hope Creek on the west slope of the Rockies, north of Golden. So as you can see, there are a lot of snowmobile tracks on the slope that were wiped out by this avalanche, meaning that a lot of people had ridden in this area before this avalanche was triggered. It's not known how many people had climbed the slope prior to the avalanche releasing. This avalanche was triggered by a snowmobile and unfortunately resulted in a fatality. So here's a graph that outlines the concept a bit for us. It contrasts the effect of avalanche depth on avalanche probability versus consequence. So we should focus our attention to the extreme right ends of the green and blue lines. So when we have deep avalanches, or deep persistent weak layers, sorry, we have a much lower probability of triggering an avalanche. And the reason for this is that the weight of a person or a snowmobile, or even something as big as a cornice, is less likely to reach the weak layer in question. However, because it's deep, we end up with a high consequence avalanche because the avalanches will be large if they're triggered on deeper layers. So what's the underlying cause of low probability, high consequence avalanches? As you guys can see in this photo, we have some deep, wide, and very large avalanches all in one area. So why do they happen? Two scenarios typically that lead to low probability, high consequence avalanches is deep persistent slab events and persistent slab events. So a deep persistent slab is a weak layer that forms early in the season, typically facets sitting on a crust. There's usually an initial avalanche cycle. This is when the layer first gets buried, and it results in an avalanche cycle during that immediate time frame. The layer gets buried deeper and deeper as the season progresses, and the load incrementally builds. There can be a lull with little or no activity as the layer gets deeper and deeper. And this time frame with the lull in activity can be weeks or even months long. As the snowpack grows over the layer, that weight eventually overloads that weak layer in many areas, which then results in sporadic but very large avalanches. So as you can see in the photo, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the weak layer is way down underneath the full season snowpack. So I'm sure you could imagine that an avalanche triggered on that layer would be very large. So these avalanches occasionally run to valley bottom and even up the other side of valleys in some instances, as you can see in this photo. So here's another shot that'll give you the idea of what kind of category of avalanches we're talking about with deep persistent weak layers. Again, as you can imagine, this would have been a high consequence avalanche if a person were to be involved. So here's a persistent slab scenario, which is a little bit different from a deep persistent slab scenario. So you have a persistent weak layer that forms on the surface of the snow. So in the image there, you can see we've got ground cover, we have some old snow, and then we have a persistent weak layer that forms on the surface. It's often something like surface hoar. And then we have snowfall that buries that persistent weak layer. Typically an avalanche cycle occurs. The persistent weak layer gradually gains strength while it gets buried deeper and deeper in the snowpack. And as it gets buried deeper, again, same thing as with the deep persistent scenario, sporadic avalanche activity occurs as the layer slowly gains strength. There may also be a lull in avalanche activity with this scenario. So as you guys can see, whether it's a persistent slab scenario or deep persistent slab scenario, it sort of results in the same situation in terms of low probability, high consequence avalanches. So you don't need to get too hung up on whether it's persistent slab or deep persistent slab. So you can imagine that it's midwinter, riding conditions are often excellent, and you may not see any evidence of the typical signs to tell you that there's an instability. So when we talk about the typical signs, what we mean are things like lumping, shooting cracks, recent avalanches. So these will typically not be present in the scenario of these sporadic but large avalanches because they're much deeper in the snowpack. So these sporadic avalanches may be spread out over a large geographical area. And so even for seasoned professionals, it can be difficult to recognize when this condition exists. It's really tricky, but there are some things that you can do to manage your risk during these periods. So why does it matter? Because it's tricky. And learning how to manage them takes time, but it's not actually that complicated when you get right down to it. So what you can do to manage these situations. Know what the problem is. So reading the forecast is really important as the issue may not be evident from just looking at the danger ratings. You'll have to read the details and pick out some keywords to understand what they mean. The forecaster's blog. This is a tool that the forecasters can use to address an issue like this more directly. And special public avalanche warnings are often issued when low probability, high consequence conditions exist. So if there is one issued, it's worth it to pay attention. Now this is a well-timed presentation as a SPA was issued today for a few areas in our forecast regions. And it's just for this reason exactly. So know how to reduce your risk. Know yourself. This is referring to an individual's level of risk tolerance. Reduce or eliminate your exposure and resist the urge to step out. So conditions often stagnate and remain relatively unchanged for extended periods of time, even when there's a persistent or deep persistent problem in the snowpack. You may get tired of hearing the same old messages day in and day out, while there seems to be nothing significant happening in the mountains. Likely many of you have experienced this. So the forecast danger ratings look like this quite often, and it's easy to think that at times like this, that not that much is going on. But if you look closely and read the text in the headline, it's obvious that something is going on. So tricky conditions persist in the alpine with fresh wind slabs and the continuing possibility of avalanches releasing on deep, weak layers. Conservative terrain selection remains critical. If you drill down into the next level in the forecast, the problem section gets into it even deeper. So here we have avalanche problem number 2, persistent slabs. As you can see in this image, it outlines what elevation it's a problem at, what aspects it's a problem, the chances of avalanches. So here you can see it's unlikely to possible, but the expected size is large to very large, size 2 to 4 expected. And here in this slide here, we have terrain and travel advice. Our current forecasts are a little bit different than this, as this is a slightly older image. And this terrain and travel advice is now on the front page of the avalanche forecast underneath the danger ratings, but the same idea applies. So based on the avalanche problems that are present, the forecasters will choose terrain and travel advice to help you manage whatever kind of avalanche problems are present in your forecast region. So here's some keywords here. That various persistent weaknesses throughout the snowpack create the potential for large avalanches stepping down to buried weak layers. and that heavy triggers like a cornice fall could trigger deep and destructive avalanches. So those are some things to key in on in the forecast. Again, we have the terrain and travel advice here, which I'll remind you again is found on the front page of the current forecast, but definitely very useful information there. And it's directly linked to the avalanche problems within the forecast. So you'll see there's some commonality here between the different areas where forecasters put information in the forecast. So conservative route selection is mentioned again. Terrain with low consequences. That term step down is in here again. And full depth avalanches, so that tells you they're going to be big. So some keywords when it comes to low probability, high consequence avalanches. We have deep weak layer, low probability, overhead hazard, deep persistent slab, step down, high consequence, complicated, unpredictable, discipline, persistent weak layer, conservative terrain, tricky conditions, thin spots, heavy triggers, cornice fall, sporadic, patience. You kind of get the idea. But if you see these words, and you won't necessarily see all of them in one given forecast, but these are some phrases to key in on, because when the forecasters use these, it's often the case that we're dealing with a low probability, high consequence scenario. So here's an example of a blog where we directly address the subject. So quite often our forecasts will steer the reader to the blog when there are tricky conditions at play. It's a place where we can speak in a bit more detail about complicated subjects. So sometimes we may not directly address the low probability, high consequence subject, but it's very often embedded in what we're writing about. In this case, it's pretty direct as the title is low probability, high consequence. But you'll see that there's, again, some key words thrown through here that you could key in on, even if the title wasn't so revealing. So some of the key words here, like we just described in the last slide, we have persistent weak layers, big avalanches. It wasn't mentioned in the keywords, but here's one here that talks about buried weak layers waking up. So this sort of keys into the idea of that lull where there's limited avalanche activity or perhaps none on a layer, and then you start to see that increase. Sporadic is in here again, unpredictable. Triggers are often large. So this blog, again, has a bunch of those keywords in it, as well as a very obvious title. So a special public avalanche warning, or SPAW, is another tool that we can use to get the word out about this type of condition. You may not see the words low probability, high consequence being used directly, but if the condition exists, the keywords again will be embedded in the text. So low probability, high consequence scenarios are prime time for SPAWs to be issued. It's exactly these kinds of problems that this communication tool was designed for. So it's sort of for times when the danger rating doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. So with this tool, we're also trying to get the message out to as wide an audience as possible. So back to knowing how to reduce your risk. Know yourself, reduce or eliminate exposure. So that's sticking to simple terrain, minimizing or eliminating overhead exposure, and resisting the urge to step out. So being patient and disciplined is extremely important when it comes to dealing with this scenario. So what does that mean? Know yourself. It seems a little bit corny, maybe a little bit new age, but it's worth acknowledging that in reality, we're learning more and more that understanding yourself is key to reducing your risk in the backcountry. So what kind of risk taker are you? If you have a low threshold for taking risks, you may not have to make big adjustments for a low probability, high consequence scenario because you may already tend to stick to pretty simple terrain. But if you're someone with a higher risk threshold, this is definitely the time to really pull back. So when it's high avalanche danger and the evidence is right in front of you, it's easy to be conservative. However, when the evidence is not easy to pick out, it's really, really hard to stay conservative, especially when you're goal driven and there are so few weekends in a given winter. So when we say pull back or choose conservative terrain, this is the kind of place that we mean. And while it may not be that exciting to ride in places like this, it's pretty exciting to come home and live to ride another day. So here's a non-simple piece of terrain. So this is a steep and potentially convex feature that resulted in a pretty deep avalanche, as you can see by the crown at the top. So avoiding steep and convex slopes. So here's an interesting image with a pretty large avalanche in the middle. And there's a few fairly obvious terrain features here. So there's a pretty big gully on the side here, some obvious convexities, some terrain trap in the bottom. So lands in a big flat spot with lots of room for the debris to pile up nice and deep. And another thing that is interesting about this is that, of course, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of trees in this photo. So we often think of riding in the trees as a safe place, but we still need to think about all those same features of terrain that we would think about if there was no trees. So again, that's the steep convexities, the terrain traps, those kinds of things, regardless of whether or not there's trees present. So interestingly as well, when you look at this image, if you look over on this side here where my pointer is, this part didn't avalanche. It's hard to tell from the photo what the slope angle is, but I would suspect that there's a significantly lower angle to the slope on this side, and it may have been a better objective than down the middle of this feature. And if we look on the other side of the image as well, there's a nice ridge line here that sort of slowly tapers off into some low angle slopes. Again, probably a good piece of terrain to choose over this section in the middle here. So avoiding thin and variable depth and rocky avalanche terrain. So this is key advice, and it's exactly this type of terrain that should be avoided when low probability, high consequence avalanches are happening. So if you have a look at this image, and if you look at the ski track right here where my pointer is, you'll see that the track goes right over top of this big rock in the slope. Now this rock here provides a shallow snowpack area, which means that even though the weak layer may be deeply buried, in this particular spot, it's going to be much shallower, which means that it's easier for the weight of a person to impact that layer and potentially trigger an avalanche. So this is what forecasters are talking about when they're telling you to avoid these thin, variable depth, rocky, thin to thick is another term commonly used. So this is the kind of feature that we're talking about, and this is exactly why right here. Here's another photo sort of zoomed in. You can see a crown here with an obvious thin spot above a couple of rocks here, in fact. And when you look at the section of the slope that hasn't avalanched, it's fairly obvious what kind of piece of terrain you're dealing with here in terms of thin snowpack, shallow, rocky area. So here's another example of some thin variable depth snowpack areas. This image can show how seemingly random these events are, but they aren't, and that's sort of the point. So you might notice that there are numerous tracks in this image, and there's a common route that folks travel here slightly out of view on the left of the image. But there's a ton of tracks in this photo, and the point here is that nothing happened for all kinds of people who were riding in this area until somebody hit that sweet spot, that thin spot, and triggered an avalanche. So because it's really difficult to predict these avalanches, this is exactly the kind of piece of terrain that we need to avoid. And it may seem difficult because you might see people riding on that slope. And again, like in this image, a bunch of people rode it without triggering it, but you don't want to be that one person who does trigger it. So a little bit of background on this image is that it was from Allen Creek from the 2016-17 season. It's a size 3 and there were 5 people involved. So minimizing your overhead exposure is key as well. So large loads like cornices falling can be that big punch to a slope that can trigger a deeply buried weak layer. Here's another example of a big piece of overhead terrain that you wouldn't want to be underneath in this scenario. So this is a natural cornice triggered size 3.5 avalanche in the Esplanade range of the Selkirk Mountains. And this avalanche actually broke the ice on the lake below and created enough of a wave to push water 30 meters up the slope on the opposite end of the lake over 1 kilometer away. So pretty impressive, not something you'd want to be underneath. So here we have a situation where you have potentially a small avalanche stepping down to a much larger avalanche. So smaller avalanches triggering, or what we call stepping down to deeper weak layers, can result in very large avalanches. So in this image, the small avalanche on the right traveled downhill for 10 to 20 meters, and then its weight triggered another size 3 avalanche that ran in surprisingly low angle terrain. And that's what this one is here. So staying away from large slopes where smaller avalanches might come down from above can be key as well in terms of minimizing your overhead exposure. So this is the kind of scenario as well that will be mentioned in the forecast. So there are some sections of the forecast where the forecasters will point towards this issue, and they may say things like storm slabs in motion may step down to persistent weak layers, resulting in large avalanches. So that's a key piece of information to look out for in the avalanche forecast. So small avalanches can look pretty innocuous, but the weight of the snow being carried by them are certainly more than you would imagine. And in a lot of instances, it's all that is needed to trigger those deeper weak layers. So here's another example of some large overhead exposure. I think it kind of says everything with all the debris piled up in the valley bottom. So patience. Patience is a key thing here. We talked already about resisting the urge to step out. So think back to when we were talking about knowing yourself. So when it's high avalanche danger and the evidence is right in front of you, it's easy to be conservative. You know, when you're seeing avalanches running, when the snow is wumping and you see cracks shooting out in front of you, it's very easy to pull back on the reins and choose simple terrain. But this gets tougher as we're not seeing those obvious clues and we want to get into bigger terrain. So with typical avalanche cycles, the danger gradually decreases, and you know that it will. So in relative terms, danger decreases over a short period of time. The time scale is days. But when it comes to low probability, high consequence avalanche scenarios, the time scale is in weeks and sometimes months. It may be weeks or months before the problem starts to heal itself, and during that time, you'll read the same messages over and over again in the avalanche forecast, to the point where you might start to think it's a conspiracy to prevent you from having a good time. But it's not, and patience is key. Discipline, so it's in there somewhere. Sometimes you got to look hard to find it, but stick with it. That's the important message here. Stick with being able to resist constant urges and pressures to get into bigger terrain. And sometimes this is something as simple as seeing tracks in bigger terrain and thinking to yourself, yeah, the forecast says I should be conservative, but I see people everywhere and nothing is happening. That doesn't necessarily mean that nothing will happen, especially when these problems are being heavily pointed to in the forecast. So if we want to go over some of the key points here for low probability, high consequence avalanches, one of the big take homes here is that it's tricky and there's a ton of uncertainty when managing these issues. And managing uncertainty is best done through conservative terrain. It's about the only thing we can do. So knowing the problem, this is a key part. So this is something that you're going to pull out of the Avalanche forecast or the forecaster's blog, or if it's really a problem, a special public avalanche warning may make extra efforts to point people towards this issue. So knowing how to reduce your risk, that's the next step of this. Know the problem and then know what to do about it. So knowing yourself, be honest with yourself about what kind of person you are in terms of your risk threshold. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just a self-awareness thing. And then reducing or eliminating your exposure to the kind of terrain that might produce these avalanches. And then being patient and disciplined is the key here, because it's super tough. You have a nice sunny day, you don't see evidence of avalanches, but you got to trust that the folks that are trying to keep you safe know what they're talking about, and it's worth listening. So patience is super key here. Okay, thanks everybody for sitting through that. Colin, do we have any questions rolling in from folks?
Yeah, that was awesome, Kate. I've already got a couple of questions lined up, and folks, feel free to use that hand raise feature. I see one person's got their hand raised already. Feel free to use that or type into the chat box, the question chat box, and we'll get your questions to Kate here. First one from KG here is asking, do persistent weak layers simply heal too slowly over time, or does it not heal at all? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I would say that they do heal eventually, but they do heal very slowly. And a lot of the time when there's a persistent problem in the snowpack, personally, I almost don't consider it fully healed until you roll into a spring scenario where you have a bunch of days of melt during the day, so hot temperatures, and then a good solid refreeze overnight. I mean, that being said, that's kind of the scenario where you're kind of guaranteed that things are healed. But yeah, there's definitely some gray area in there, and if you're not seeing these sporadic events on a layer, it's generally considered to be healed. But yeah, it's hard to decide when that time really is. When you see these problems disappear out of the avalanche forecast, though, that often says a lot about the forecaster's confidence in it no longer really being a problem in the forecast. That being said, they do sometimes make their way back into the forecast if there's an event that would give big inputs to the snowpack, like a big warm up or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of times for sure where we know that there's a deep persistent weak layer in the snowpack, but we haven't seen avalanches on a long period of time. The kind of weather conditions kind of lend themselves to this probably not coming out as a problem, and to kind of save our ammo for those times when we really want to shout that it's a problem from kind of the mountaintops, we have to kind of pull back on those when we know it's there, even though it's probably not acting as a problem. So definitely good to keep an eye on things.
Definitely. And sometimes, so if you drill into all the different tabs of the forecast, there may be situations where a particular deep persistent or persistent layer is not mentioned on the problems page, but there still might be some mention of it in the snowpack summary, often with a little tidbit of information on what, although unlikely, what kind of terrain you might trigger that avalanche in. And so when it's not on the problems page, but it's in the snowpack summary, it's not a huge concern, but there are some isolated sort of terrain types that you might be able to trigger that layer. And then when it disappears from the snowpack summary as well, I would say that the forecasters generally consider that layer to be healed or gone for the season.
Yep, good advice. We have a hand raised from Natalia Pavlova here. Natalia, I'm going to unmute you, and if you still have your question, pipe up and let us know. Are you there? Oh, I've unmuted you. You'll need to unmute yourself. But if you just raise your hand and put it away, that's fine too. I've got another question here. We'll wait on Natalia and she can pipe up if she's still there. One other question here from Jen. She's asking, are the avalanche problems listed on the forecast in order of priority or advisory? So that maybe we can just talk a little bit about the problem order, and then i.e. wind slab is problem 1. Is it more likely, or is it more likely or a bigger hazard than problem 2? What's kind of the weighting factor that makes it problem 1?
I think that most forecasters probably set it up where the problems are ordered in likelihood of triggering. That's probably the case 99% of the time. Occasionally, I think there's times when the persistent problems are maybe a little bit more frequent than what would be referred to as sporadic, and because they are so large, they might be the first problem, even if you're more likely to trigger a wind or a storm slab on that day. But you would have to be fairly likely to trigger those deeper layers if that's going to be problem number 1 above something like a storm or wind slab. So typically speaking, it's usually the problem that's most likely.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can think of times where maybe we've got like a loose dry problem and a persistent slab. That loose dry for me is probably going to be problem 2. Nobody's probably going to get buried in that loose dry, but the persistent slab is on my mind, even though it's maybe a little bit lower probability. But like you say,
Yeah.
I think the common setup is the more likely the problem is, the more likely you're going to run into it, encounter it in the hills. That's likely going to be your problem 1.
Yeah, but yeah, that's a good example.
Looking up for some more questions, we've got another one here from Allison. She's asking, or she's saying, you said that it can take weeks or months for deep persistent weak layers to heal. How do they heal?
That's a good question. So over time, snow crystals of all kinds start to bond together with each other. And there's lots of very techie stuff that we could get into on this subject, but the short answer is that fresh snow crystals, like, you know, the nice stellar snowflakes that we see falling during a storm, those kinds of snow crystals tend to break down and bond with one another very quickly. Whereas weak layers that get categorized as persistent or deep persistent are things like crusts, facets, and surface hoar. So those larger kind of crystals take a lot longer to break down. They take a lot longer to sort of have their edges become rounder, and they take a really long time to actually start to stick together with the snow around them. So that's the reason why it's so slow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can think of a lot of times where everybody around me is excited that it snowed in October, and I'm like really concerned that we've got October snow in the Alpine that's going to turn into a nasty bed of depth hoar for avalanches in the future.
Yeah.
We've got one here from Sean. He's asking, since persistent weak layers are so hard to trigger or harder to trigger, are compression tests or extended column tests an unreliable tool for detecting the probability of one of these releasing? What's your take on snowpack tests and persistent or deep persistent weak layers?
Yeah, that it sort of depends, but typically the rule of thumb is that for snowpack tests like that anything that's deeper than about 120 centimeters, it's not like it's not worth doing, but if you don't get any result, it may just be a factor of how deep it is and the fact that the force that you're putting on the snow isn't reaching that layer. There is another test that maybe some folks in the audience are familiar with called the deep tap test. So what you do in this instance is you actually remove the snow from above that weak layer. So it can only be done if you can properly identify the weak layer that you're trying to test. So once you identify that, you remove all but 15 centimeters from the top of that layer. So you're just left with a small amount of snow above that layer. And then you run through the same sets of tests that you would on a normal compression test. So it does give you some idea of fracture character basically, but it's harder to quantify with those results what kind of likelihood you have of triggering the layer. But the whole fracture character thing, for people who are familiar and comfortable with using that kind of information, the deep tap test mainly gives you that information. So whether it's a resistant planar, a sudden planar, sudden collapse, those kinds of those kinds of things. So that would be the more appropriate test to look for with the persistent and deep persistent layers, especially if they're buried more than 120 centimeters. And the other thing that I would say about that is that the unpredictability of these layers is so great that while I would definitely consider snowpack tests useful information, I don't really approach any slope by making my decision of to go or not go based on a snowpack test, but it's all good information to plug into your brain and have that all to draw on.
Absolutely. I think the propagation saw test would maybe be another one, depending on kind of the consistency of the layer and whether you can draw a saw up through it. It's a little more complex and takes a lot of digging to set one of those up, but they can be kind of dramatic if they fail. And yeah, certainly like a big, tall compression test column, that's going to give you, if you're isolating more than 120 centimeters down the back, you're for sure going to get some unreliable results deeper in the snowpack because you've got this teetering column up there.
Yeah,
good
that's
points.
right.
So we got another question here from Jennifer. She's curious, what were the ratings during these slides? So there was a bunch of different slides that we saw. Can you think of any, or just like a general idea of what type of ratings you'd expect to see during these kinds of conditions?
I don't know specifically what the ratings were for any of the avalanches in the slides, but it's definitely not uncommon to have large avalanches in a low probability, high consequence scenario, even when the hazard is moderate. There's definitely a chance that some of those happen during considerable. I would be willing to bet that none of them happen during high hazard and probably none of them happen during low hazard, but that's not a guarantee either. But my guess would be considerable or moderate.
Mm-hmm. A great case for why to move beyond just looking at the ratings, right? Understanding the problem and how that supports the rating is such a key part of how you're going to plan your terrain use for the day, hey?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Julian here is asking, well, he's stating, first of all, one of the most common mitigation strategies is to stay on low angle terrain. But there's some inconsistency here on what constitutes low. Are we talking about 25 degrees, 20 degrees, 15 degrees? What do you consider low angle terrain?
I would consider anything under 25 degrees to be low angle terrain. One of the other sort of key characteristics of these types of avalanches, because of the depth and potential size of them, if you are on generally low angle terrain, but it's maybe broken up with a few really small sections that are steeper than that, like, quite a small slope, say it's, 5 or 10 meters high, it's probably unlikely that a layer that deep would run on a feature that small. So yeah, it's sort of, I guess the answer again is sort of it depends, but as a rule of thumb, I would say under 25, and then if you're going in anything steeper than that, to keep the features very small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of links back a little bit to the type of problem that we're dealing with, right? Because we've seen even some examples of some deeper avalanches on pretty low angle slopes. You can bet that in the avalanche forecasts during those times, there's probably some attention being paid to the low angle slopes and probably some elevated ratings to go along with those
Definitely,
problems.
yeah.
Oh, cool. We've got a hand up question. So I've got Greg Bennett here with his hand up. I'm going to unmute you, Greg, and let you answer or ask your question. Oh, try again. Sorry, I think I remuted you by accident. Are you there still, Greg?
Yeah, I believe so. Are you there?
There you are. Yeah, we got you.
This is just, we have a non-contiguous SPA for two different areas in the north and in the south. And I thought it was interesting and wondering why that is. That's the first part of the question. And then the second one is that the forecast has stayed the same all week for the South Waterston area. And even with the SPA issued, hasn't changed at all. So just wondering if there's any reasoning behind that, if it's a lag. I'm sure it isn't a lag, but I'm sure there's some reason for that. And just wondering about that. Those two questions. Yeah.
Cool, thanks for the question, Greg. In terms of the non-contiguous sort of geographical area of the ratings, I don't have a deep level of familiarity with the avalanche conditions in some of the rocky mountain park areas, so Jasper, Banff, Yoho, those kind of areas, and they are managed. The forecasts are issued by the national park staff. So when we do a spa like this, we reach out to those other agencies and ask them if they're seeing conditions that are similar to what we're concerned with. And if they say yes, such as with Waterton, then they'll join in on the spa and we'll include that region. But if they say that they don't think the conditions that we're seeing really apply to their area, then yeah, then it gets left out. So yeah, again, I don't have a lot of familiarity with what's going on in those regions, since they're not they don't get forecasted by us, but they do get dealt with by very seasoned professionals. So if they're not seeing those conditions, then it's just kind of the way that it shakes out sometimes, even though it can look a bit odd on the map. But yeah, obviously the pros in those areas don't think that those layers are really in play in those regions. And then in terms of the rating in Waterton, this is a great question because it really outlines how the danger ratings often don't tell the whole story. So danger ratings are in a lot of ways kind of a broad brushstroke. So they point to sort of the likelihood and size of avalanches. So even in moderate hazard, you can have large avalanches in some areas. So if you're not seeing a ton of avalanches, it may be well enough captured, technically speaking, by a given rating. And so just because there's a spawn effect doesn't necessarily mean that the rating is going to or should jump to high hazard. You know, high hazard indicates that there's basically widespread avalanches everywhere, and that's typically not the case with this scenario. So it's really like a big part of the reason why we want to talk so much about this situation, is because it is often something that the person reading the forecast has to really drag out of the forecast. Like we try to make it, of course, as obvious as possible, but it definitely is something that's often really not well captured by those ratings. So we need to elaborate on it within the forecast.
Okay, that makes sense. Just the nature of high being widespread everywhere is probably the key distinguishing factor for why that doesn't move. Whereas, okay, so that's insightful for sure. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Yeah, I'd say that natural avalanches in pretty widespread areas is pretty consistent with, like, you almost need to see that in most cases for a high danger rating, hey? And
Yeah.
a lot of those regions, I think of like Jasper National Park in particular, like really beats to a different drum in terms of like the snowpack character in relation to those other regions. Even though they share borders, those borders definitely, a lot of thought went into where those go, and it's remarkable how well they kind of capture local conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. We've got one here from Morgan. They're asking, are you able to comment on the factors that contributed to the slide in the poop chutes on Blackcomb Mountain during moderate conditions a week or two ago? Can you think back to that one?
I personally don't have a lot of information. I haven't forecast for the coast for a few weeks, so I don't know, Colin, if you have any background on this.
On it. Yeah, so I was actually writing the coast forecast during that time, and the conditions that brought about, I guess set up the scenario where that avalanche occurred was a big kind of outflow wind event. So winds, really elevated, strong winds, and quite widespread through elevation bands. So from alpine all the way to kind of lower elevations, we were seeing it as well. North and east winds just ravaged the mountains in many parts of the coast range, and particularly in kind of coastal inlets. So Whistler is kind of along one of those coastal inlets, kind of connects up with Howe Sound up that valley. And so it was subject to these really powerful outflow winds that took what was loose snow available for wind transport. So there wasn't actually even any new snow associated with these avalanche, or the conditions on that day. We had recent snow that was blown by wind in basically the opposite of what you'd usually see. For the most part, in most areas of the province, we kind of have a predominant kind of southwest flow or even westerly flow of weather and wind, and we saw the reverse of that happening. And so when that happened, There was all kinds of layers like I can think of crusts on solar aspects and maybe even some facets associated with that. So kind of sugary, weak snow at the surface that was being buried by windblown snow from the direction that's opposite to what you'd normally expect. And it set up a pretty touchy wind slab on that previous surface. And yeah, it was definitely dangerous avalanche conditions that day and in days following as well. That problem, to my knowledge, has settled out a fair bit, which is not atypical with the wind slab problem. They tend to persist for a fairly short period of time, but even that problem was on our minds for a little longer than normally because of the layers or the surface that wind slab had formed over. The presence of crust and facet layers was definitely concerning to us. We were kind of kept our guards up for a little longer than normal with the wind slab problem on that one. Now we've got Greg. He's curious about the spa as well, asking, so for the spa issue today, what's the reason? Oh, it's again about the non-contiguous spa. So I think we've covered that. Oh, that was Greg, same Greg. He typed it in as well. Good. And he's typed in his next question as well. And I think we've got, yeah, there's a string of 3 that I think we answered with our little chat there. Julian's in here again, asking, is there anywhere else to find AITS maps? AITS is the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale, besides the avalanche.ca trip planner. They've seen AITS maps on BC Parks boards at trailheads that don't show up on avalanche.ca. Any familiarity with this AITS question?
I don't personally know other places to access that kind of mapping.
Yeah, that's my go-to as well, and I'm a little surprised to hear that there are some at parks boards that are like AITS map that we don't have in our trip planner. But I would imagine, I'm not confident on this, but that there could be just some kind of waiting in the hopper that are gonna end up on the trip planner in days to come. I'd encourage you though, if you have a question about a specific area, send that an email through to the Forecaster inbox, forecaster@avalanche.ca, and we can look into it. If there's a specific area that's mapped at a trailhead but isn't online, we can probably look into it for you. We've got KG here as well, wondering, do trees also contribute to a thinning of the snowpack similar to rocks, like you mentioned?
I guess I'm not going to say that they couldn't, but I would say they don't typically. You know, when trees get sort of fully buried by the snow, there's quite a bit of snow that fills in all around them. They don't have as much mass as a rock, and they also, you know, they're a little bit bendier and what have you. So, yeah, it's not. I'm sure it's not impossible, but it's definitely not the kind of thing when you see a deep avalanche release out of a thin snowpack area. It's usually a rock and not trees that are kind of the culprit for those shallow thin spots.
Yeah, makes sense. Roshan is asking, could you speak to why the danger rating was considered moderate for the sea to sky at the time the Poop Chutes avalanche if there were high levels of concern about the conditions? That morning, I believe, of that avalanche, we actually issued an update to danger ratings, and then we ended up with considerable danger in the alpine and moderate danger at tree line, which was consistent with other operators in the region. The danger at that time was very much or almost completely isolated, like in terms of where problems were really quite problematic or widespread wind slab conditions, where it was really focused in the alpine, and there was a little bit of kind of noted. Some operators were noting wind transport at tree line, and we started to get some reports at a later time of some wind that had gotten into lower elevation terrain. But for the most part, it was kind of ridge tops and alpine terrain that was the most affected by this wind event. Rihanna is asking, can you talk more about what creates thin layers around rocks?
Yeah, so it's just if you think about how the ground cover looks, if you have a big rock that sticks up into the snowpack, it's going to take longer to get buried than the ground around it. And so, you know, if you have a 2-meter snowpack, but you have a rock that sticks up 1 meter into the snowpack from the ground, then the snowpack above that rock will only be 1 meter, if that makes sense, in the simplest terms. you know, as rocks take longer to get buried as well, if they're sticking out of the snowpack in the early season, they often, even if snow lands on them, it'll get blown off by the wind. So that kind of exacerbates the problem in lots of areas. But yeah, basically it's just that there's a section where the ground is closer to the surface of the snow.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't see any new questions, but we're still open. If you've got another question, feel free to type it in. The raised hand function works as well. Feel free to bump in there. We'll give you a couple minutes or a minute maybe. And I thought this was super useful. To me, I mean, low probability, high consequence avalanche problems, it's not just a tricky time to kind of make decisions in the backcountry. It's, for me, it's tricky to give people the advice that they can kind of take away and feel like they've addressed the problem. And it's a challenge for forecasters for sure. And that's why I think like you were mentioning, the blog is such a useful tool for us to be able to get the word out in less of a, you know, it's tougher to pin all your communications on a rating when the conditions are like this.
Mm-hmm. And this situation is definitely at play in a few of our forecast regions right now. So it's definitely a timely presentation and discussion to be having. Actually, Colin, I forgot to ask you about the polls. Should we have a look at where everybody's recreating?
We can absolutely do that. I've got a couple new questions here too. So first we'll run a poll. We've got do you want to go mode, training, or region?
Let's start with mode and then roll through the other two, I guess.
Folks, we're curious, what is your preferred mode for accessing the backcountry? I'm going to launch this poll and you can see it there on your screen. Let us know how you get around in the backcountry. Lots of skiers and boarders coming in here, some snowshoers, a bit of snowmobile. That's awesome to see the spread. No ice climbers this time around. They all checked out Sarah Hunikin's and Grant Statham's ice climbing talk though. So
excellent.
They got their fill. I'm gonna probably close it there. We got 77% of people, 78% voted. So I'm gonna close it. And this is kind of the lay of the land. We've got, oh, here we go. I'm sharing it now. Mostly skiers and boarders, a few snowmobilers and snow bikers and snowshoers. No ice climbers tonight.
Cool. How about the regional one?
Let's do that. So I'd be curious to see if we're dealing with folks in regions that the spa
totally
is active in. Yeah. So I'll launch that. Where are you guys all from? Where do you recreate? Where do you hit the backcountry from? And the results are coming in. South Coastal, good representation there. Probably explains some of the sea to sky questions. Makes sense.
Some Rockies folks.
Yeah. Which, you know, low probability, high consequence, deep persistence lab problems. This is their bread and butter, right?
Yeah, this is a common scenario in the Rockies for sure. Yeah.
Cool. 81% voted there. I'll go ahead and close it and share it. So this, folks, is what you all look like, where you're from. Northwest Coastal and Yukon, not as much. They're too busy. The Northwest Coast has just been getting pounded with, they're just resting for another ski day tomorrow, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're shoveling their driveways.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another question here, raised hand from Susanna Zach. I'm gonna unmute you, Susanna, and we're ready to hear your question. Oh, did it work? She is self-muted. I'm gonna, Susanna, we're ready for you if you're ready. But she might have stepped out. Her hand's been sitting up there for a couple minutes. Let's try, I've got Jeanette McIsaac here, and I'm gonna unmute you, Jeanette, and we're ready for you. It could be, oh, her hand was raised for a while there. No luck with Jeanette. I'm going to leave you unmuted so that if your question comes up or comes back to you, you can just speak up and you'll be online. I think we can take this poll down. And I've got a couple more questions here. Did we answer whether trees anchor deep slabs?
We didn't.
Okay, do trees anchor deep slabs? What's your take?
I would say not. I wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't put a ton of weight into that. I mean, if the trees were thick enough to anchor the snow, they'd be too thick to travel through.
One thing that kind of strikes me when I think of like the kinds of places where deep persistent slabs release, not usually in like heavily forested terrain. I kind of think of the alpine, big slopes. It's usually where you see these kinds of things happening. I don't want to say that they don't happen in forested terrain, but probably a little less frequent. And I'm not sure if it's as much because of the forest cover, but I think that probably plays a role, hey?
I think that's the case potentially for deep persistent problems, but lots of persistent slab problems
yes.
are surface hoar, which they're often the ones that surprise people in the trees because surface hoar, it's fairly easily destroyed by the wind. So it's the kind of thing that there may be surface hoar that forms all over the mountains, but then sometimes the wind breaks it down before it gets buried. But then that means that it's often well preserved in places where it's sheltered from the wind by trees. So open glades in the trees are often the kind of place where you find a surface hoar problem, so a persistent slab problem.
Yeah, that's like one of the scariest places in the mountains to me when I think of like a glade in a place where surface hoar forms. I might be surrounded by trees, but in that glade, I'm not feeling safe for sure.
Yeah, lots of things to hit on your way through.
That too, yeah. KG's asking, are ski cuts, he uses quotations marks, safe to do against very deep layers? What do you think of this?
I would say no. I would shy away from ski cutting anything that I think could produce, well, really even a size 2 avalanche. Like, I don't really want to be taking the chance that something might break above me and trigger a size 2 or bigger. So typically with these deep layers, we're thinking about avalanches that are size 2 and bigger. And with the low probability scenario as well, it's often the case that it's not obvious like a storm slab where a ski cut across a feature is going to give you a lot of information. And like you saw in some of those photos where there was tracks everywhere, it's often the case that people can rip around all over a slope, and it's not until someone hits that particular sweet spot, which you probably won't recognize just by looking at the slope when it's covered in snow. So yeah, it's not a strategy you want to rely on for those layers.
Yeah, ask yourself what layer you're targeting and what's going to happen if you're successful. And if it's a size 3, then it's no longer a ski cut. It's accidental.
Yeah, and if you cruise across the start zone hoping to ski cut a deep layer and you don't trigger an avalanche, I wouldn't consider that to mean you won't trigger an avalanche further down or somewhere else in the slope. That wouldn't be information to me that would make me feel confident that I'm not going to trigger something.
Yeah, the whole premise of a ski cut kind of falls apart, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Roshan's asking, he says it's not really related, but I think it's related. Can slabs propagate across pillows? So like in a pillow field, boulder field?
I think it would kind of depend, like if the pillows are on kind of big rocks and features so that the pillows themselves are kind of elevated out of the main snowpack and really disconnected from each other, then I would say no. But there's lots of pillow fields where they're all just sort of little mushrooms that are fairly well interconnected, in which case, yes, they can definitely propagate across those.
Yeah, that's where my mind goes too, is are they connected, right? Okay, I think that's it for questions, but I'm going to double check that hand raise. Still got Jeanette there, but I'll try her one more time. Doesn't look like, nope. Okay, I think that's all we've got. We're kind of just past 8 o'clock too, so I think that's all the time we've got. Oh, one more question here from Rihanna. Can you tell us how to find the Abby blog on the phone app? I'm pretty sure you have to actually go to the website to get to the Forecasters blog. And is that right? Or am I just wrong completely?
I'm not sure, actually. I think that's right. rather than,
Let me take a quick look here. It could be under planning if the planning. Yep, I'm pretty sure you need to go to the website to view a blog. Yeah, I hope I'm not wrong. And there was one more here. I don't want to miss out Julian's, and it's actually a pretty cool question here. Some people seem to dig multiple pits per outing. Others seem to only dig one every few outings. What sort of pit habits do you recommend? I think this is a great question. Good one to wrap it up.
That's a really good question. I'm definitely an advocate for lots of investigation in the snowpack. But then that also has the question of what are your knowledge gaps? So what information are you looking for? If I'm in an area that I haven't been in all winter or perhaps ever before, I'm going to dig quite a bit and investigate that snowpack. If I'm skiing in my local area and I've got a good handle on what's in the snowpack, I may not necessarily dig every time I go out. If there's a layer, even if I'm familiar with the snowpack, it's my local area, but there's a layer that I'm wondering about, such as the kinds that we're talking about tonight, I might dig every time I go out to sort of try to monitor how that layer is changing over time. So am I noticing it becoming less reactive as the days go on? Is it becoming more reactive as the days go on? That kind of thing. So, I mean, unfortunately, because it's the same with all these kind of things, the answer in a lot of ways is it depends. But yeah, I mean, if you don't know what questions you have about the snowpack, then it's hard to say how digging is going to answer them. So if you're looking at sort of an initial assessment type thing because you have no idea what's going on in the snowpack in a given area, then digging will answer lots of questions. If you have a layer in mind that you're wondering about, digging will answer lots of questions. But yeah, I'd be wondering what my knowledge gaps are and how I can fill those in with digging rather than just sort of digging for the sake of it, basically.
Good advice. Thanks, Kate. And thank you all for joining us. I think to a really well-timed presentation for something that we're seeing now in Western Canada now, and we may be seeing well into March as well. So something that we're kind of keeping an eye on. It's a good reminder for folks like yourselves to really pay attention to keywords in the avalanche forecast and to dig deeper into the forecast if you see the persistent slab or deep persistent avalanche or deep persistent slab avalanche problems mentioned in the forecast. As always, there's many resources on our website to help you learn more about avalanche safety, how to plan your trips into the backcountry. It's a great place to get to start or to get a refresher, or a great place to start or get a refresher is our new online avalanche tutorial. It's called Avi Savvy. If you're interested in this training, be sure to check out the website under the Learn tab, and all kinds of avalanche course links as well there too. As always, we appreciate your interest in avalanche safety. It means a great deal to us, as does your material support. So you can support essential programs like these by donating as little as $10 to Avalanche Canada. Just click on the link in the question chat box to donate. Now, our next webinar is Thursday, March 11th, and it's all about why is March the deadliest month of the year for avalanches. Just like tonight, pre-registration is required, but no cost. We want to thank every one of you for coming out and showing an interest in avalanche safety. We hope you enjoy the rest of your winter safe from avalanches, and we'll see you next Thursday. Bye for now.